The unmistakable sound of an unfamiliar key rattling in my front door lock sent a cold wave of tension through my chest. The kind of instinctual alert you don't unlearn after 25 years of military service. Through a narrow crack in the blinds, I spotted her, the woman with the perfectly ironed emerald blazer and self-importance, stitched into every movement, struggling with the lock as if the house belonged to her. When the key didn't fit, she didn't hesitate. She whipped out her phone and called 911, confidently fabricating a tale of ownership. All while I watched silently from inside my own living room. She had no idea who was on the other end of that line. But I did. Today, the slow-turning wheels of justice had started to grind forward, and she wouldn't see the blow coming. My name is Samir Malik, and at 47, I'd left behind a career as a Navy officer and settled into what I thought would be a peaceful, civilian second life in a quiet suburb called Rosebend Heights. After 2.5 decades of commanding teams and handling conflict zones, I now worked for a small private security firm that mostly dealt with retail chain safety assessments and digital infrastructure audits. I bought my house 6 months ago, a charming single-story home nestled under tall oak trees with a clean front yard and a small patch of soil where I'd planted a single red rosebush to brighten the place up. My son, Hamza, 28, worked as a dispatcher for the city's 911 emergency center and often shared stories about his shifts. I never thought our paths would cross in his work until the rosebush incident. The first formal warning came on a warm Monday morning. The sun had barely crested the rooftops when Mrs. Bina D'Souza, the self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood's soul and president of the HOA, appeared at my front door in her trademark blazer and expression of superior authority. Clipboard in hand, she handed me a citation printed on HOA letterhead. "Mr. Malik," she declared, "you are in violation of Section 4.7 of our community regulations. Red roses are not permitted in front yard landscaping. Only white or pale pink varieties are allowed under the approved horticultural color scheme." I blinked, half thinking it was a joke, but the bold $200 fine on the paper told me she was dead serious. "I'm sorry, I didn't see that regulation anywhere in the paperwork I received when I purchased the house," I said calmly. Her laugh was clipped and condescending. "The regulations were revised last month. All residents were notified via email. You have 48 hours to remove the violation or face further penalties." That night, I called Hamza to vent about the absurdity. His initial reaction was to laugh, but then his voice shifted into something more focused, more alert, the tone I'd trained him to adopt when details mattered. "That's weird timing," he said. "I processed a call from your neighborhood earlier today. A woman reported a suspicious middle-aged man digging in his yard. She said he might be burying something illegal." My heart sank. "She gave my address, didn't she?" "Yours, Dad. I had to send a patrol unit, but they found nothing, obviously." That's when I realized this wasn't about a flower. It was the opening move in what Bina clearly saw as a game. Over the following days, her campaign escalated with the kind of cold precision I'd only seen in tactical operations. Every morning, she'd appear without fail, her heels tapping on the pavement like war drums, clipboard at the ready. On Tuesday, I was fined $50 for curbside vehicle obstruction. My car had been parked outside for just 23 minutes while I unloaded groceries. On Wednesday, she cited me for improper lawn maintenance because my grass allegedly exceeded the maximum community standard by a quarter inch. She pulled a tiny tape measure from her blazer to prove her point. "Perhaps your neighbors are also in violation," she said, when I gestured to identical grass heights on either side. "I'll be conducting thorough inspections." Thursday, the violation was my front door color. She insisted it was autumn sage instead of the regulation forest sage. I could barely tell the difference with both swatches in my hand, but her trained eyes saw it instantly. "Consistency," she lectured, "is what keeps communities from slipping into decline." Every time I asked for proof of the regulations she referenced, she claimed they were being digitized or under community executive review, and that I should trust the board's judgment. But I didn't, and I started digging. My background in security work and military protocol taught me how to navigate bureaucratic systems, and I began with my property deed. What I found stunned me. My lot had been sold directly from Rose Heights Development Company, the original builders of the entire subdivision, and had never officially transferred governance to any registered HOA. In simple terms, the HOA had no jurisdiction over my property. I wasn't under their rule, and Bina D'Souza's directives were nothing more than hot air. Every fine, every citation, every violation she handed me was legally meaningless. Armed with this knowledge, I watched her daily appearances with a new level of calm. I wasn't just amused, I was preparing. She didn't know it, but her entire house of cards was already beginning to wobble. And then she made her boldest move yet. Bina printed a formal invitation to an emergency HOA meeting and distributed it to every mailbox in the neighborhood. The subject, the Malik problem. She reserved the community center, transformed it into her courtroom, and filled the room with residents. Chairs were neatly aligned like a town hall. At the front, Bina stood behind a table with a projector, handouts for all, and a slideshow titled Upholding Standards, the case of house number 118. with a theatrical tone that bordered on satire. She clicked through photos of my rosebush, annotated grass measurements, and color swatches of my front door. Her voice trembled with self-righteousness as she declared I was eroding community harmony. Some neighbors nodded nervously, others looked confused, and when she proposed a $2,000 fine and a mandatory compliance order, I stood up. Calmly, I said, I'd like to request copies of the actual HOA documentation showing these rules, and the minutes from the meeting where they were voted on. A flicker passed over Bina's face. Not fear, not yet, but uncertainty. She quickly regained her footing. Mr. Malik, the board's decisions are not subject to open challenge. Compliance is mandatory. Her voice shook slightly now. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply replied, then I'd like a copy of your bylaws and the registered HOA charter that authorizes you to issue binding citations. That's when it cracked the masks you wore daily. The fake authority. The assumed power. It was all bluster and I knew it. The residents didn't erupt or cheer, but they murmured. They whispered. I could tell I wasn't the only one who'd been pushed too far, but I wasn't done. This war was just getting started. It was a quiet Saturday morning when I first heard the sound of tires crunching across my gravel driveway. Steady, intentional, too early for a casual visit. I looked through the window and there she was again, Bina D'Souza emerging from her car with military precision, emerald blazer pressed to perfection and clipboard tucked under her arm like a judge holding a verdict. But this time, she wasn't alone. With her came a locksmith, a stocky man lugging a toolbox and key-cutting machine, clearly unaware of what he was walking into. I opened the front door calmly as they approached, coffee in hand, not a trace of anger on my face. Mr. Malik, Bina said, voice laced with self-righteous confidence. Under Section 12.4 of the HOA's Emergency Enforcement Guidelines, I have the authority to secure properties that pose a risk to community harmony. She pulled out a sheet of paper that looked official but bore no county seal, no clerk stamp, just a logo she clearly printed herself. This locksmith will be changing the locks on your property immediately. You'll receive new keys once. All fines are paid and violations resolved. I didn't respond. I didn't argue. I hit record on my phone, capturing every word, every smug expression. The locksmith hesitated, sensing something wasn't right. But Bina waved him on with such assuredness that he shrugged and got to work. I stepped aside without resistance and began dialing my old Navy buddy and real estate attorney, Barrister Zam, and a man who'd helped me interpret the original development deeds, and confirmed I wasn't legally under HOA governance. He answered. On the first ring, Zaman, she's here with a locksmith. They're changing my locks. He paused, then exhaled slowly, and I could practically hear his grin. David, he said, using my old calcine from our military days, you just hit the jackpot. If an HOA changes locks on private property without court order or title rights, it's a violation of multiple state and federal laws, including unlawful entry, coercion, and seizure without authority. Don't stop them, film everything, let them bury themselves. So I did. I stood outside, nodding to the locksmith and sipping my coffee while Bina barked orders and took pictures of her own handiwork. She genuinely believed this was her moment of triumph. I spent the night at a hotel not because I couldn't access my home, but because Zaman said it would strengthen the case. Meanwhile, Hamza, my son, continued monitoring Bina's behavior through official dispatch records. Dad, he told me over dinner that night, do you realize she's called 911 12 times in the last 3 weeks, all reporting you? He scrolled through a log on his phone. Suspicious activity when you mowed the lawn. Possible narcotics when you got a pizza delivered. Suspicious packages when you ordered tools from Amazon. She's flooding the system. I raised an eyebrow. And every single time, Hamza said, responding officers found nothing. In fact, they've started putting notes in the system warning about her misuse of emergency services. She's on thin ice. That's when I knew her world was starting to crack. With Zaman's help, we began assembling a formal case, not just against the bogus citations, but against her very position. I reviewed every document in the Rosebend Heights archive. The bombshell was sitting there in plain sight. Not only had the development company never formally transferred authority of my lot to the HOA, but according to the county registrar, the HOA itself had no legally recorded appointment of Bina D'Souza as president, no election, no community vote, no meeting minutes, nothing. She had simply assumed control when the previous board leader moved away, appointing herself into power and gradually tightening her grip by intimidating the entire neighborhood. And it wasn't just me. I started talking to other residents. Mrs. Farida Patel, an elderly widow 3 houses down, confessed in a whisper that she'd been fined $75 for leaving her newspaper on the porch for more than 15 minutes. Was in the washroom, she said softly, and when I came out, the ticket was there. Tom Boaty, a mechanic who worked swing shifts, had been cited for washing his car at 10 a.m. Apparently I violated quiet hours, he said, incredulous. It was daylight, and I wasn't even using a pressure washer, just a hose. Others were fined for mailbox paint, garden gnomes, wind chimes, and even watering potted plants during the wrong community hydration window. The pattern was clear. Bina had turned the HOA into her personal instrument of control. Then I found the smoking gun. Through a Freedom of Information request and a few discreet interviews, Zaman and I discovered Bina had set up a private company under the name Rosebend Community Harmony Solutions 18 months ago. Every month, the HOA paid this company $5,000 for community compliance services. In other words, she was paying herself $60,000 a year using HOA funds, all while pretending to serve voluntarily as president. There were no financial disclosures, no budget approvals, no community knowledge whatsoever. The level of fraud was stunning. Zaman nearly choked on his tea when I told him. "She's a con artist in a blazer," he said, "and I think she's about to get exactly what she deserves." The next step was simple. Set the trap. I returned to my now illegally locked home and planted a bright yellow sunflower right in the center of the front yard, knowing Bina would take the bait. Sure enough, she showed up the next morning, clipboard ready, a fresh violation notice in hand. "Mr. Malik," she said loudly so the neighbors could hear, "you are now in violation of Section 7.2, unauthorized botanical installations. Yellow flowering plants are explicitly prohibited in front displays. This carries a $500 fine." I looked her in the eye. "May I see the actual documentation for that regulation and the community vote that approved it?" Her jaw tensed, eyes narrowing. For the first time, her composure cracked, the air shifted, and I knew we were just getting started. The pause in Bina's breath after I asked for documentation lasted barely 2 seconds, but it spoke volumes, a momentary disruption in her finely rehearsed authority, a chink in the emerald blazer-clad armor she'd worn like a second skin since the day she seized power. She quickly recovered, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear and snapping, "The HOA's executive board is currently finalizing the digital archive. You'll receive access once all formatting is complete. Until then, compliance is still mandatory." Her tone carried the smugness of someone who'd built her kingdom on intimidation and expected the world to follow suit without question. But what she didn't know was that her empire of fake citations, forged authority, and fear-based rule was about to collapse under the weight of her own arrogance. That afternoon, Zaman and I finalized a full legal dossier including deed, history, HOA, registration gaps, misuse of emergency services, witness statements from multiple neighbors, and financial fraud documentation regarding the payments funneled through her fake consulting company. We compiled everything into a digital binder and sent an official cease and desist letter addressed to both Bina and the HOA mailing list she controlled, making it clear that continued harassment would lead to civil litigation and potential criminal charges. Attached were full copies of the evidence, itemized and time-stamped. I didn't hear from her for 2 full days. Not a single fine, not a visit, not even a passive-aggressive post on the community board about lawn decor. I knew she was quiet not because she'd backed down, but because she was scrambling. True to form, on the 3rd day, she fired back. This time, not with another violation, but with a mass email titled, "Urgent Community Integrity Alert, Mr. Malik's Malicious Campaign." It was a long-winded, emotionally charged piece of propaganda meant to win over the residents she'd spent years intimidating. In it, she painted herself as a victim of coordinated slander, claimed that my allegations were false and dangerous, and insisted I was trying to destroy the very fabric of the neighborhood she had worked so hard to preserve. She even threw in a line about being threatened by me, a former Navy officer, for dramatic effect. But what she didn't anticipate was the flood of responses her email triggered. Within hours, dozens of neighbors replied, not to support her but to share their own stories. "You fined me $100 for a garden hose," wrote Tom Botti. "You made my wife cry over a mailbox color," added another. "You told me wind chimes were weapons," someone else said. The entire chain spiraled out of her control. Screenshots of the email thread were shared on Nextdoor, Facebook, and even Reddit. One post titled, "HOA Dictator Finally Called Out by Veteran Neighbor," racked up over 5,000 likes in 2 days. The neighborhood, once silenced by fear, had found its voice, and it wasn't singing her praises. Zaman's office received multiple calls from residents asking how they too could pursue claims or recover fines. Even the locksmith who had changed my locks emailed us with an apology, attaching a copy of the so-called authorization form Bina had given him. It was laughably fake. No HOA registration number, no county seal. Just a logo she had likely designed in Microsoft Word. But the real breaking point came when Hamza, from inside his dispatcher role, forwarded me an internal memo. The police department had flagged Bina's number for frequent false reports and had formally warned her that any further misuse of 911 would result in criminal citation. She had filed over 15 bogus calls, all linked to me or neighbors who had dared speak out. The memo even included audio logs. I listened to one, her voice trembling with manufactured fear as she claimed, "Mr. Malik is displaying threatening military behavior by adjusting a sprinkler system aggressively." The officer had clearly been rolling his eyes during that call. "Ma'am, that's not a crime," he'd said. "He's watering his lawn." I sent the recordings to Zaman. He laughed so hard he had to mute the call. But behind the humor was real legal weight. Misuse of emergency services. fraud, harassment. We had enough to crush her, and the time had come. I scheduled a private community meeting and hand-delivered invitations to over 30 homes. The flyer was simple. Let's talk about truth, rights, and the future of Rosebud Heights. No logo, no fear, just transparency. The night of the meeting, we met in the local library's community room, the same space where Bina had once staged her HOA court show. This time, she wasn't in control. Residents filled every seat. There was no projector, no slideshow, no judgment table, just people, tired and ready for clarity. I stood in front of them, holding nothing but a USB drive and my integrity. I laid it all out, calmly, factually, professionally. I showed the property deed proving I wasn't under HOA rule. I shared the county records showing Bina's presidency was never legally appointed. I explained how she created a fake business and paid herself from their HOA dues without consent. Then I played one of the 911 audio recordings. The room was dead silent as her voice played through the speaker, describing how a middle-aged veteran might be burying something suspicious, all because I planted a rosebush. When it ended, there was no applause, no outrage, just the heavy silence of people realizing they'd been manipulated for years. Finally, Mrs. Farida stood up and said softly, "I was always afraid of her." That broke the silence. A chorus of nods followed. People began sharing their own finds, threats, and fears. The next morning, 15 households filed complaints, with the HOA board demanding a special meeting and a vote of no confidence in Bina's leadership. One brave soul even contacted the local news. By the weekend, a camera crew was interviewing residents on their lawns. The headline read, "HOA president accused of fraud by retired Navy officer." The photo, Bina standing at her door slamming it shut on a reporter. It was poetic. Still, she tried one last desperate play, sending out legal-looking letters, warning residents they could be fined for participating in unauthorized meetings. But the bluff had lost its teeth. The community had seen the truth, and the woman who once ruled with fear now ruled only in name. That wouldn't last much longer. The official special meeting of the Rosebud Heights Homeowners Association was held on a warm Friday evening under a heavy sky, not just with the weight of clouds but with the tension of long-suppressed voices finally ready to speak. Over 50 residents showed up, more than triple the usual attendance, and not a single one arrived with the same old deference or fear that Bina D'Souza had once commanded, like a queen guarding her fake throne. She sat at the front table in her signature emerald blazer, her hair styled perfectly as always, though her posture betrayed a growing sense of unease. To her left sat 2 remaining board members, both of whom had been silent accessories to her reign but were now nervously glancing around, as if preparing for the inevitable fallout. I watched from the back row, arms folded, a silent witness to what I knew would be the turning point in our neighborhood's history. The room buzzed with low whispers, rustling printed agendas, and the quiet anticipation of long-awaited justice. When the meeting was called to order, Bina immediately launched into a self-defense monologue, a carefully rehearsed performance delivered with the dramatic flair of someone who'd spent too many years hearing herself talk without question. She claimed the recent accusations were fabricated, that I had waged a personal vendetta against her, and that any confusion regarding her appointment or the payments to her consulting firm were technical oversights easily clarified with updated filings. But this time, no one nodded. No one murmured in support. Instead, residents raised their hands one by one to speak, and every voice echoed the same theme. Enough. Tom Botti stood up first, waving a stack of HOA violations he'd received over the past 2 years. "You fined me $75 because my daughter drew chalk hearts on our driveway," he said, voice tight with restrained anger. "That's not leadership. That's cruelty." Mrs. Farida followed, shaking as she recounted how Bina had threatened to report her to code enforcement because her porch light was too bright during Ramadan. One by one, the stories poured out: petty fines, intimidation, emails laced with threats, citations for mailbox decals, for flag displays, for humming while gardening. And when one of the board members tried to cut them off, the crowd roared back. "Let them finish," someone shouted. We'd been quiet long enough. It was clear the tide had turned. Then came the motion, read aloud by a quiet man in a polo shirt who had never spoken at a meeting before. I moved to remove Bina D'Souza from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. Pending legal review of misappropriated funds, improper enforcement of non-binding rules, and violations of resident rights. The vote was not close. 46 votes for removal, 3 abstained. 1 vote against Bina's as she stared around the room, eyes wide with disbelief. Something in her cracked. She stood, slammed her palm on the table, and shouted, "You're making a terrible mistake. I built this community. I protected your homes, your values, your property." No one responded. The silence said everything. Then, with shaking hands, she snatched her files from the table and stormed toward the exit, muttering threats about legal retaliation and lawsuits no one would take seriously anymore. Her era was over. But I knew it wasn't just about removing her. It was about repairing what she'd broken. In the days that followed, The newly elected interim board, made up of honest, concerned neighbors, reached out to me and examined. They requested our help auditing the HOA's finances and reviewing all citations issued over the past 3 years. What we found was staggering. Over $120,000 had been funneled through Bina's private company, with no receipts, no invoices, no documented work, just monthly transfers marked community oversight fee. Dozens of fines had no legal basis, and many were simply invented, not tied to any community vote or approved guideline. The new board immediately began refunding residents who had paid under duress, and a formal report was submitted to the county district attorney's office. Meanwhile, Bina's last-ditch efforts to rally support backfired completely. She sent dramatic massed emails claiming she was the victim of a deep-state neighborhood conspiracy and even tried to launch a GoFundMe titled "Help Me Defend Our Community Values," which was flooded with sarcastic comments and quickly taken down. The final blow came when the DA's office officially launched an investigation into HOA fraud and misuse of resident funds. A subpoena was issued for Bina's banking records, and within days, local news outlets picked up the story. Reporters knocked on her door. Camera crews circled her home. Headlines read, "HOA president accused of embezzling $120,000 from residents in neighborhood revolts against fake HOA tyrant." Even the locksmith from weeks earlier gave a statement to the press, admitting he felt pressured by a woman who claimed to have authority she clearly didn't possess. It was over legally, publicly, and reputationally, but I didn't feel triumphant. I felt relief, because this had never been about revenge. It had been about the truth and about standing firm when someone tries to steal peace from the very home you built to find it. As the interim board began rebuilding community trust, I quietly took down the sunflower in my yard and replaced it with a small sign. It didn't say "no trespassing" or "private property." It simply read, "Truth lives here and in Rosebend Heights." After years of fear and silence, that truth had finally been heard. Bina D'Souza didn't disappear quietly after the vote. She dragged herself through every possible denial phase, from outrage to delusion to desperation, refusing to accept that her empire of fear had collapsed. But the law didn't wait for her emotions to settle. Within 3 weeks of her removal as HOA president, the county formally charged her with fraud, unlawful impersonation of a public officer, and misappropriation of community funds. The district attorney's statement made the evening news. "This office takes abuse of authority and financial deception seriously. Residents should not live in fear of those entrusted to serve them." Footage aired showing her being escorted out of her home for questioning, and for a woman who had spent years micromanaging mailbox colors in Garden Heights, it must have been unbearable to no longer control her own front door. Meanwhile, I returned to my own home with the locks changed back to my key, the rose bush blooming stronger than ever, and a quiet sense of peace that hadn't existed for months. The interim board finalized the audit exam and I helped oversee, and every single resident who had paid a baseless fine was refunded. Some of them even received personal apology letters signed by the new board. They held a community barbecue to reset the tone of Rosebend Heights, and for the first time since moving in, I saw my neighbors not as quiet, isolated victims but as proud homeowners reclaiming their space. Children played on the sidewalks again, porch lights stayed on, flags returned to gardens, and those who had once whispered their frustrations now spoke freely, laughing, shaking hands, and greeting one another like people who had finally exhaled. One morning, Tom Botti walked over with a coffee in hand and said, "Samir, I never thought anyone would stand up to her. You didn't just fight for yourself, you fought for all of us." I smiled and nodded. All it took was one person not backing down, but it hadn't just been me. Hamza's insight, Zaman's expertise, the neighbors' bravery. We'd done it together, piece by piece, like rebuilding a wall that had long been cracked. In the weeks that followed, Bina's trial date was set. She was facing several counts of HOA-related fraud, and the evidence was overwhelming. Forged citations, fake HOA letters, fabricated meeting minutes, falsified payment authorizations. Her private company, Rosebend Community Harmony Solutions, had already been dissolved under investigation, and any claims she made about her legitimacy were falling apart faster than her carefully curated image ever had. Her attorney, a cousin from out of town who clearly had no idea what mess he was walking into, tried to spin the charges as administrative missteps from a woman doing her best to manage chaos. But the judge wasn't moved, and the residents she had targeted showed up to testify, not with rage, but with calm, irrefutable truth. "She fined me $80 for a bird feeder," one woman told the court. "I paid it because I was afraid," another elderly man said. "She told me if I put Christmas lights up before December 10th I'd be written up." That was the final straw. They were all simple stories, but together they formed a clear narrative. Bina had weaponized her fake authority, and now the real law was finally turning its gaze on her. In the end, she struck a plea deal to avoid jail time, agreeing to repay over $100,000 in restitution, relinquish any claim to HOA involvement in the state, and issue a formal written apology to the residents of Rosebend Heights. Her house, once immaculately perfect, went up for sale 2 months later. The new owners were a young couple who said they'd heard about that insane HOA story on YouTube and thought the neighborhood looked too peaceful to be real. I laughed when I overheard it. They weren't wrong, it had become peaceful. Finally, with new leadership in place, the HOA board was restructured with actual oversight, open voting, and resident transparency. They threw out 47 outdated or fake rules, simplified the community code into a 2-page document, and created an open forum night every month for residents to discuss neighborhood needs. For the first time, Rosebank Heights felt like a community. As for me, I stayed quiet online about everything. No interviews, no podcast appearances. But I did start a personal blog, not for clout, just to document the journey. I called it Lines in the Lawn, and one post in particular got shared thousands of times. It was simple, a photo of the rosebush captioned, "She said it violated community beauty. I said it belonged to the earth." Turns out the earth agreed. It wasn't about flowers. It never had been. It was about ownership, dignity, and the power of not backing down when you're in the right. One day Hamza called me and said, "Dad, you know there's a whole subreddit following this now, right?" I chuckled and said, "Let them, maybe someone out there is fighting their own." Bina, that's what made it worth it, not just reclaiming my peace but helping others realize they could reclaim theirs too. Sometimes bullies don't look like criminals. Sometimes they look like neighbors in pressed blazers with clipboards and fake smiles. But their power only works if you give it to them. And once you stop, once you push back with truth and patience, their kingdom falls like it was made of paper. Today, I water the same rosebush without checking my surroundings. I leave the sprinkler on past 9 a.m. I hang wind chimes on my porch and whistle when I sweep the sidewalk. No one knocks, no one finds, no one dares. The HOA still exists, but now it serves, not rules. I never wanted a war. I just wanted peace. But if war comes to your doorstep wearing a name tag and fake rules, you stand your ground. Because a man's home isn't just a house. It's his line in the lawn. And mine will stay marked forever. Her voice rose until it echoed through the walls of the meeting hall. Sharp and authoritative, nearly a shout as she declared, "I am the duly elected president of this homeowners association. My decisions are final and non-negotiable." But I didn't flinch. I stood calmly, eyes steady, voice measured as I replied, "I understand your position, but surely you can provide documentation supporting these regulations. That seems like a reasonable request from any homeowner facing substantial fines." Her face tightened, and the carefully curated professionalism she usually wore like armor began to slip. "You have no right to question my authority," Bina snapped, her polished tone cracking under the weight of pressure. "I don't owe you explanations or documentation. You will comply with community standards or face the consequences." That moment was the beginning of her unraveling, though she didn't yet know how far she'd already fallen. I contacted Zaman, my attorney and longtime friend, and together we sent an official legal request demanding every shred of HOA documentation she had, meeting minutes, financial reports, election records, and anything proving her authority to govern. 2 days later, her response arrived not from her directly but from her lawyer, filled with bluster and empty threats, accusing me of harassment and intentionally disrupting lawful community governance. But behind the bluster was desperation, and the real blow was coming because Zaman had just uncovered the final piece that would shatter everything she'd built. The real trigger, though, came while I was out of town visiting Hamza for the weekend. I returned Sunday evening to find something no homeowner should ever see: my house sealed off, front door locked with a brand new mechanism I hadn't installed, and a bright orange notice plastered across the frame. It read, in bold print across what looked like official HOA letterhead, "This property has been secured under HOA authority due to repeated violations of community standards." Below that, it claimed I had to schedule a consultation and pay all accumulated fines before access would be restored. The fury I felt in that moment was eclipsed only by my resolve. I called the police, and within 20 minutes, Officer Sharik Martinez arrived, his uniform crisped, demeanor composed, clearly a man who'd dealt with HOA conflicts before. I handed him my property ownership documents, and as he flipped through them, his brow furrowed deeper with every page. "Let me get this straight," he said, confirming each point slowly. "You own this home outright. There are no liens, no mortgage complications, and you've never missed a payment to any legitimate governing body. And this woman, claiming to be HOA president, changed your locks and barred access." I nodded yes, all because she didn't, like the color of my roses, the height of my grass, or the shade of my front door. He looked from the papers back to me and shook his head, jaw tight. "Sir, nobody has the authority to change locks on a privately owned residence without a court order, regardless of HOA claims. That's illegal trespassing and property interference." Right on cue, Bina pulled up in her usual spotless sedan, stepping out in her emerald blazer like a corporate general arriving at a battlefield. She walked toward us with her usual confidence and extended her hand to Officer Martinez, who ignored it. "Officer, I'm Bina D'Souza, the duly elected president of Rosebank Heights Homeowners Association. I appreciate your timely response to this community disturbance. He glanced at her with the detached politeness of someone who'd already made up his mind. "Ma'am, this gentleman says you changed his locks without his permission. Do you have a court order or any legal documentation granting you that authority?" She smiled in that same patronizing way she always did when challenged, like explaining the rules to a confused child. "Officer, as president of the HOA, I am fully authorized under the community charter to secure properties that endanger the appearance and stability of our neighborhood. Mr. Malik has been repeatedly not with regulations designed to protect our shared property values." "Ma'am," he interrupted gently but firmly, "do you have any legal orders, a lien, a judge's approval? Anything that gives you rights to this man's private home?" "That's not necessary," she insisted, a slight edge creeping into her voice. "I am the HOA president. My authority is recognized under state law and community charter." Officer Martinez turned to me and asked, "Would you like to press charges?" I stared at Bina for a long moment. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but I could see it, the smallest flicker of uncertainty. She thought she could bluff through this, like everything else, but I had something better than charges. "Actually, officer, I'd like to request an emergency community meeting. I think the residents deserve to know exactly what's been happening in their name." Bennett's jaw tightened, but she forced a smile. "Of course, Mr. Malik. I would be happy to walk the community through our shared standards again." That evening, word spread like wildfire. 45 residents showed up to the community hall, a number we'd never reached in any HOA meeting before. The room was buzzing, not with idle chit-chat, but with anticipation, anger, curiosity. People had heard what happened, how the police were called, how the locks were changed, and they wanted answers. Bina had prepared for war. The room was arranged like a courtroom, chairs lined in rows, a projector at the front, her table raised slightly above the rest. Her PowerPoint was titled Community Standards and Problem Residents, and her tone, as she opened the meeting, was as dramatic as it was rehearsed. "Fellow homeowners," she began, "we are gathered here tonight to confront an unfortunate but necessary truth. One of our residents has engaged in repeated defiance of HOA standards, resisted cooperative enforcement efforts, and has now resorted to legal tactics designed to obstruct the orderly operation of our community." Slide by slide, she detailed my so-called violations. The red roses, the alleged parking infractions, close-up photos of my front door, measurements of my lawn. Each image was accompanied by captions, arrows, and policy excerpts, most of which she still refused to share in full. Her voice was steady, firm, as she moved through the performance, and for a moment I could see some neighbors nodding, falling into the rhythm of her authority again. But I didn't flinch. When she finally turned toward me with that smug little tilt of her head and asked if I would like to explain why I believed I could ignore the rules everyone else followed, I stood without a word, walked to the front of the room, and connected my laptop to the projector. The screen flickered, and the title of my own presentation appeared in plain, bold letters: Truth, Authority, and the Law. I looked out at the crowd, people I hadn't known well until recently, people who'd once whispered their frustrations in private but now sat silent, waiting for someone to finally say what they'd all felt for years. "Thank you, Bina," I said, voice even, my posture straight. "I'd like to take a few minutes to present some facts, not opinions, not interpretations, just facts. And you can decide what kind of leadership you've really had." As I clicked through the first slide of my presentation, silence fell across the room, the kind of silence that stretches taut like wire just before it snaps. Displayed clearly on the screen was a direct excerpt from the state's civil code regarding homeowners association governance, specifically outlining that any rule changes or enforcement procedures require at least 30 days. Written notice to all residents and formal approval by at least 60% of the community through a recorded vote. The legal language was dense, but the message was clear. No regulation could be enforced unless it had been openly presented, voted on, and passed with majority support. I turned to the crowd and said, according to this, any of the rules Bina has been citing must be accompanied by official voting records and documentation showing community approval. Otherwise, they are unenforceable. I looked directly at her. "Bina, can you please show us the vote logs or meeting minutes where these regulations were passed?" Her expression faltered for the first time that night. She shifted in her chair, lips parting as if searching for a script she hadn't written. "Those were internal updates," she began, her tone suddenly defensive. "Procedural updates that didn't require a vote." I was advised that no, I interrupted, not angrily, just firmly. "The law is clear. No updates, no matter how procedural, can be enforced without transparency and majority consent. What you've been enforcing has no legal foundation." I clicked to the second slide, a spreadsheet of HOA financial transactions that and I had obtained through a combination of state transparency requests and resident cooperation. The room filled with murmurs as people saw line after line, showing monthly $5,000 payments made to a company called Rosebend Property Management Solutions. I let that sink in, then spoke. "This company is owned entirely by Bina D'Souza. That's her signature on the incorporation documents. And she has paid herself over $60,000 in the last year from your HOA dues. Audible gasps rippled through the crowd. People leaned forward in their seats. One man squinted at the figures on the screen and mumbled, "That's where the maintenance funds went." I moved to the next slide, screenshots of Bina's business registration, her HOA emails authorizing payments to her own company, and bank statements linking the HOA account to hers. Not only was this never disclosed to any of you, but there are no invoices, no contracts, no service logs, just transfers. She created a fake consulting firm, billed it for community services, and funneled money straight into her own pocket. I paused and let my final slide appear, a scanned document from the county registrar's office. "And now the most important piece," I said quietly. "This is a copy of my property deed. My house was purchased directly from the original developer. There is no record anywhere of this property being transferred into HOA jurisdiction. Legally, the HOA has no authority over my home, which means every citation I received, every lock change, every threat, was not only illegitimate, but criminal." The room went completely still. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Then I added, "And if she did it to me, how many others here has she done it to without legal standing?" I turned toward Bina. Her face was pale now, the confident mask long gone, her hand visibly trembling as she tried to adjust the clipboard that suddenly looked like a useless prop. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. That's when Hamza stood from the back row, where he had been seated quietly until now. "I'm Hamza Malik," he said, voice clear, cutting through the silence. "I work for the city's emergency dispatch center, and over the last 4 weeks, I've personally processed 12 911 calls from this neighborhood, all from Bina, or reporting my father for suspicious activity, mowing the lawn, receiving mail, ordering pizza. Every time officers responded, they found nothing. My colleagues are already preparing a report on her misuse of emergency services." Murmurs turned into shock. A few people stood up. One woman near the front asked, "She reported you for mowing the lawn." Another man shouted from the side, "She fined my wife for using wind chimes." Suddenly, the room erupted, not in chaos, but in clarity. Years of quiet fear were transforming into a wave of indignation, and the tide had fully turned. Residents began standing up one after another to share their own stories. A soft-spoken woman named Naila recounted how she was fined $100 for leaving her recycling bin out for 20 extra minutes. A man named Shabazz explained how his daughter's bike was confiscated from the porch because it violated decorative harmony. Another couple revealed they had paid nearly $1,500 in fines over a 2-year period for what Bina called lawn inconsistencies. Someone else shouted, "I want my money back," and a chant broke out, "Audit, audit, audit." The 2 board members seated beside Bina scooted their chairs away, suddenly very interested in their notes. I took a step forward and raised my hand to calm the room. "I don't want revenge," I said. "I want truth, I want transparency, and I want a community where no one lives in fear of absurd rules written behind closed doors by someone who was never elected, never authorized, and never honest." A man near the back stood up and said, "Then let's vote." That was all it took. Someone pulled out the community bylaws, the real ones, printed years ago, which clearly outlined the procedures for an emergency vote of no confidence. The requirements were simple: a quorum of at least 30 residents and a majority vote. We had over 45 in the room. Bina tried to protest, but her voice was swallowed by the rising collective momentum. A simple vote was held, and the result wasn't close. 42 in favor of removing her, 2 abstentions, 1 against her own. And just like that, Bina D'Souza was no longer the president of Rosebank Heights. As she stood there frozen, a neighbor named Adnan walked up, took the projector remote from her shaking hand, and turned it off. The light on her face vanished, leaving her in shadow, stripped of power, stripped of pretense. She didn't speak as she gathered her things. She didn't look at anyone. She walked out of that hall alone, clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield that no longer protected her. And as the door closed behind her, the room erupted not in celebration, but in deep relief. People exhaled like they hadn't in years. Some hugged, some wept, some simply sat in stunned silence, trying to process that the nightmare was over. After Bina walked out of that hall, a stillness hung over Rosebank Heights, like the first calm after a violent storm. And while she was gone physically, the aftermath of her reign still lingered in the systems she'd twisted, the finances she'd drained, and the fear she had instilled in every corner of the neighborhood. But within days, the new board, made up of residents who had long been quiet observers, stepped forward to begin the process of repairing the damage. They reached, well, to Zaman and me directly, asking for help auditing past transactions, validating citations, and rebuilding trust. What we found shocked even those of us who had been expecting corruption. More than 60 residents had received fines under regulations that didn't legally exist. Over $120,000 had been funneled into Bina's fake company over the span of 18 months, money that was meant for lawn maintenance, community events, and playground improvements. No one had ever seen a proper ledger, and no one had dared ask until now. The new board acted fast, refunding residents who could provide proof of payment, cancelling all outstanding fines, and suspending HOA fee collection until an independent accountant could verify where every penny had gone. Meanwhile, Bina's world was collapsing far beyond the boundaries of our street. The district attorney's office launched a formal investigation after receiving our compiled dossier. What had started as community complaints was now shaping into something more serious: multiple counts of HOA fraud, financial misconduct, unauthorized business self-dealing, and even impersonating an elected official. Reporters began showing up with cameras and microphones. The headline on the evening news read, "Former HOA president under investigation for defrauding neighborhood," and below it, a photo of her slamming the door in a journalist's face. Her silence didn't stop the truth from spreading. Someone leaked the emails. Someone else posted her fabricated fine notices on a Reddit thread that quickly went viral. She tried to deny everything, first through Facebook posts, then through a hastily hired attorney who claimed she'd only wherever acted in the best interests of her community. But that defense crumbled when the invoices from her fake consulting firm were made public, each one billed to herself, each one signed with her name, and none of them describing a single actual service provided. Under pressure, she agreed to a plea deal that spared her jail time but required her to pay restitution, resign permanently from any HOA involvement statewide, and issue a written apology. That letter arrived, printed, folded, and stuffed into every resident's mailbox, stiff, forced, and completely devoid of real remorse. She sold her house within 2 months, disappearing from Rosebend quietly, her emerald blazer replaced by the plain clothes of a disgraced figure who could no longer hide behind rules she invented. Her house was bought by a young couple who told me, with a smile, that they'd discovered the neighborhood through that crazy HOA story on YouTube. Irony, it seemed, was alive and well. In her absence, the community changed, not in structure, but in spirit. The first official meeting of the new board was held outdoors, in the park that Bina had once forbidden anyone from using after dusk. Kids played nearby. Dogs ran freely. No one got fined. People spoke without fear. We voted on rules the right way, with paper ballots and respectful discussion. Gone were the clipboards and condescending lectures. In their place were potlucks, book clubs, and real conversation. For the first time, Rosebend Heights felt like a neighborhood again. As for me, I reclaimed more than my home. I reclaimed peace. I went back to planting, not because I had something to prove, but because I enjoyed it: bright roses, yellow sunflowers, even a small vegetable patch. One day while I was watering the front yard, Hamza stopped by with coffee and said, you could have just let it slide. Avoided the fight. I smiled at him. I could have, but then who would have fought for Mrs. Naylor, for Shabazz, for everyone who didn't think they could? He nodded and sipped his drink. You were a thorn in her side, Dad, a rosebush with roots. We both laughed, and it felt like everything had finally come full circle. Not long after, I received an invitation from another neighborhood 3 towns over. They were dealing with their own HOA nightmare and wanted advice on how to push back. I wasn't looking to become some kind of neighborhood revolutionary, but I agreed to meet them. Sometimes all people need is a nudge, a reminder that those who rule through fear only succeed when everyone else forgets they have rights to. The lesson I learned through all of this was simple. Power built on fear eventually collapses under truth. Bina believed she could fabricate control, invent laws, and bend people to her will just because she dressed like she knew better. But laws aren't fabric. Authority is not something you wear, it's something you earn. And fear only works until someone says no. That's what I did. That's what we all did. And it worked. So now I water my roses in the morning sun, wind chimes spinning softly in the breeze, mailbox proudly painted in whatever color I please, and I sleep soundly, knowing the door behind me is locked with my key, on my terms, in a home that no one will ever trespass again, not with fake authority, not with a clipboard, and certainly not with fear.